Okay, moving on to the phases of the menstrual cycle. Here you can see I tried recording it earlier also, but somehow the recording did not went well. So, okay, let's study about the phases of the menstrual cycle. So, as I told you, there are four phases: menstrual or the bleeding phase, follicular or the proliferative phase, the ovulatory phase or ovulation, or and the luteal or the secretory phase. The menstrual phase, as I told you, it lasts for 3 to 5 days. The proliferative phase, it lasts for from the days of six day to 13 days, almost 7 days. The ovulation is on 14th day, and this is lasting for 15 days, from 15th to 28th day. Right. Now, this menstruation or the bleeding phase, it marks the onset or the starting of the menstrual cycle. How it marks the starting of the menstrual cycle is this menstruation or the bleeding phase will always occur after 14 days of the ovulation. Meaning, if a female has the ovulation on 14th July, right? The menstruation or the bleeding phase will happen on 30th July, just 14 days after that, or 1st August, you can say. Now, during this phase, we can see that the endometrial lining of the uterus, it breaks off, or you can say falls off, right? And it will be released from the vagina in the form of blood. Approximately, we can see that 80 milliliter of blood is released as the menstrual blood or the period blood. So this blood is different from the normal blood because it will be very dark in color, right? It will be a very dark in color because it contains both arterial blood and the venous blood. Now, the first event, as I told you, it is seen as the breakdown of endometrium. Breakdown of endometrium, right? So the endometrial lining of the uterus, it will break down and it will fall off and get released from the vagina in the form of menstrual blood, right? Approximately 80 milliliter of blood is released. Now, why this happens? Because there is a fall in the levels of progesterone and estrogen. Fall in the levels of, so there is a decrease in the levels of progesterone and estrogen hormone. This is why the endometrial lining falls off. Because I'll tell you, first of all, just understand about the four main hormones that will be involved in the menstrual cycle. One is FSH, which is the follicle stimulating hormone. Second is LH, which is the luteinizing hormone. They both are released from the anterior pituitary gland present in the brain. Third is estrogen, which is released by the follicles, growing follicles, and corpus luteum. We'll study that. And fourth is progesterone, which is released by corpus luteum. Now just understand the event. You understand the event. You understood the event that endometrial lining is falling off, or you can also say that it sloughs off. It sloughs off. Why is it happening? Because of, I told you, decrease in the levels of progesterone and estrogen. Now progesterone and estrogen, mainly progesterone, is responsible for maintaining the endometrial lining. Is responsible for maintaining the endometrial lining, and if the level of progesterone decreases, it will cause the fall of the endometrial lining because it is not progesterone is not present to maintain the lining. That's why it will cause bleeding, right? Now, one concept I need you to understand before going on to the follicle or proliferative phase is that the estrogen hormone, it basically blocks the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. What did I say? The estrogen hormone blocks the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary of the brain. So this is a concept that you need to keep in mind. Uh, Basically, you can say in scientific term that the estrogen inhibits the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. So if estrogen is high, it will cause a negative feedback inhibition, and it will not allow FSH and LH to be released from the pituitary gland. So moving on to the follicular or proliferative phase. Now as we saw earlier, this concept should be kept in mind. As we saw earlier, the estrogen level fell off in the bleeding phase. Now, as I told you, if estrogen is high, it will not allow the FSH and LH to release. But if estrogen is low, obviously FSH and LH will get released. FSH and LH will get released. And during the follicular phase, what happens? There is a seen a rise in the levels of FSH and LH. Why this happen? Because of the low level of estrogen. Now, this FSH basically will play a role in this phase. FSH stands for follicular stimulating hormone. Now, what does this mean? We already got to know that there are follicle present in the ovary, as we saw earlier. Now, these follicles, they need to be developed and mature, right? From primordial to primary, primary to secondary, secondary to tertiary, tertiary to graphene follicle. So they need to develop and they need to mature. Now, which hormone will trigger their development? So the hormone that will cause the trigger their development is FSH, or the follicle stimulating hormone. This is released by the anterior pituitary. It will go in the ovary and tell the ovary to start developing a follicle. Start developing a follicle. So the follicle will start developing. Now, what happens when the follicle is developing? When the follicle is developing, this follicle will release estrogen. Will release what? Estrogen. So the developing follicles release estrogen, and what will happen during the phase when with passing time? What will happen? Slowly, the estrogen level will start increasing because the follicles are releasing estrogen. Earlier, estrogen was low. Now, estrogen levels are gradually increasing. One thing I would like to clear, because the follicle is growing, that's why this phase is also called follicular phase, and it is also called proliferative phase because proliferative word comes from proliferation, which basically means growth. So proliferation means growth, and here we see growth of follicles. That is why it is also called proliferative or the follicular phase. Now come back to the estrogen. Now this estrogen is rising, and estrogen has one purpose and what purpose does estrogen plays here? So it performs two purposes. First is it will go and thicken the endometrial lining of the uterus. Go and thicken the endometrial lining of uterus, because now the uterus needs to be prepared for implantation or the pregnancy, right? And it will allow the lining to be thickened up to 3 millimeter. You will allow the lining to be thickened up to 3 millimeter. And simultaneously, what it will do, it will allow the secretion of thin cervical mucus. Now, what happens? The cervix release a mucus, and normal time it is very thick, but at the follicular phase, it will be the estrogen. Under the influence of estrogen, it will release thin cervical mucus, and this is important because there needs to be uh, it will allow the entry of sperms to be eased. It means the entry of sperms will be easy because of the thin cervical mucus that is present. Now, as I told you, estrogen is also rising. For FSH and LH were also rising slowly. A time comes at the 14th day, basically half of the cycle, where FSH and LH, they are mainly increase in concentration. FSH increase to 2 to 3 times of its concentration, and LH will be increased to 6 to 10 times of its concentration. LH, known as luteinizing hormone, will increase to 6 to 10 times at the 14th day of the cycle. This is known as LH surge. This is known as LH surge. This LH surge will basically cause ovulation. This is the basic cause of the ovulation. Ovulation basically means the rupture of Graafian follicle to release the ovum. To release the ovum. So the release of ovum by rupturing the follicles, by breaking the Graafian follicle, this is known as ovulation, and it will happen on the 14th day of the cycle. Now, what happens? This is followed by the luteal or the secretory phase, which is the last phase of the menstrual cycle. What happens? This ruptured Graafian follicle, which is left, so the ovum is released, but the Graafian follicle, the ruptured part of Graafian follicle, the leftover part of Graafian follicle, is still present. This develops into a structure known as corpus luteum. This develops into a structure known as corpus luteum, or in short, you can say CL. Now what happens before this corpus luteum needs to be maintained, needs to be keep intact. It doesn't. It needs. There is a need to prevent its degradation. There is a need to prevent its degradation. Why? Because we will study the reasons later. But just keep in mind that it doesn't need to get degraded. So it needs to be maintained. And before fertilization happens, this corpus luteum will be maintained by LH, or the luteinizing hormone, and after fertilization, what will happen? This corpus luteum will be maintained by human chorionic gonadotropin hormone (HCG), which will be released by the trophoblast cells of the embryo. We will discuss that later in the uh, embryo development part. So, corpus luteum needs to be maintained before fertilization. It is maintained by the luteinizing hormone. After fertilization, it is maintained by the human chorionic gonadotropin, or the HCG. Now, why corpus luteum needs to be maintained, sir? So, the reason is basically simple, because the corpus luteum is responsible for the release of estrogen and progesterone. Release of estrogen and progesterone. So, basically, corpus luteum is responsible for the release of estrogen and progesterone mainly. Progesterone mainly it plays a vital role during this phase. Estrogen, which is released by the corpus luteum, it will further thicken the endometrial lining. It will cause the further thickening of the endometrial lining of the uterus, and it will thicken it up to 5 millimeters. It will thicken it up to 5 millimeters. Whereas the progesterone, which is released by the corpus luteum, it will help in maintaining the pregnancy. It will help in maintaining the pregnancy. Now, what will happen after fertilization? The corpus luteum is maintained, but the corpus luteum doesn't remain forever. What will happen after the implantation occurs? There is a formation of placenta. Now, the role of releasing progesterone, because the main role of progesterone, main function of progesterone is to maintain the pregnancy. So to maintain the pregnancy, there should be progesterone present always. There should be progesterone present always. So after implantation, placenta will be responsible for the release of progesterone and estrogen to maintain the pregnancy and maintain the thickening of the endometrial lining. But in case, but in case fertilization doesn't happen, these all I'm talking about after fertilization, before fertilization, and the occurring event relating to fertilization. But in case fertilization doesn't happen, the sperm is not there to fertilize ovum, what will happen then? If fertilization doesn't happen, this corpus luteum will degrade and form a structure known as corpus albicans. Corpus albicans, which is also called white body because it appears white, and this corpus luteum is also known as yellow body because it occurs yellow. This corpus albicans formed after the degradation of corpus luteum cannot produce any progesterone or estrogen. Cannot produce any progesterone or estrogen. So since it cannot produce progesterone and estrogen, their levels will decrease. The decrease in the level of estrogen and progesterone will cause the will cause the um, degradation of endometrial lining. Why? Because estrogen and progesterone were maintaining the endometrial lining, but now if they're absent, it will cause the the endometrial lining will not be able to be maintained, and it will cause the bleeding phase. The next cycle will begin. Why? Estrogen and progesterone are low in level, endometrial lining will fall off again. So, in the case when fertilization doesn't happen, the cycle will repeat. If fertilization happens, progesterone, estrogen will remain maintained. Progesterone, estrogen basically will also go and inhibit FSH and LH. FSH and LH, when FSH and LH are inhibited, it will not stimulate the follicles to grow, because we don't need any more follicle to develop or mature during pregnancy. So when at the duration of pregnancy, there shouldn't be any development or maturation of any follicle, because if another follicle develop, another fertilization can also happen. Then a person can the female would have two babies inside her womb, and the womb cannot hold two babies. Naturally it cannot hold two or three or four babies. So naturally, the nature doesn't allow two to three babies or four babies inside a mother's womb. So that's why there needs to be the what you say, inhibition of FSH and LH. Sorry, there needs to be the inhibition of FSH and LH, so that another follicle doesn't develop, and doesn't like fertilization doesn't happen in during pregnancy. And the estrogen and progesterone, they will maintain pregnancy, but if fertilization doesn't in case of fertilization, estrogen progesterone will maintain pregnancy, and in the case fertilization doesn't happen, a corpus luteum degrades to form corpus albicans. Corpus albicans doesn't produce or cannot produce any or doesn't produce any estrogen or progesterone. And if estrogen and progesterone are low in concentration, what will happen? The endometrium will again fall off, and this will be the beginning of the new menstrual cycle with the bleeding phase.